I'm joined by Tom Wilson, Director of Policy at the Counter Extremism Group, a think tank that works to find practical solutions to extremist ideologies. Good to have you with us this evening. Do you think we need a new definition?
There's clearly a problem with the current way of doing things, because the current definition that the government uses is incredibly broad, quite vague, and it means that mistakes are being made within the system when it comes to deciding who the government consults and who the government funds, which was found in the Prevent review by Sir William Shawcross, had led to funding and consultation going to actually extremists. So it's clear that this does need to be addressed, but I don't think we should be under any illusions that defining extremism is quite a complicated task, and the government certainly has its work cut out in coming up with a definition that everybody can be happy with.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is a very difficult term to define. What advice would you give then, as someone who's studied it, to the government as they try and grapple with this?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of different approaches that could be taken. One is actually, rather than trying to come up with one-line definition, essentially, for all types of extremism, as you would probably find it easier if you tried to define different types of extremism. So if you could say what far-right extremism is, that is to say what is on the extreme end of the right, and the same with Islamism as well. What is Islamist extremism? What is far-left extremism even? That would be one approach that I think the government would find much easier to pursue. But what the second approach is if they try and define it quite narrowly so that they aren't infringing on people's concerns about freedom of expression, the fact that people should be able to have politically controversial views and free speech without it automatically being defined as extreme. I think what's important to reassure people about in the public, though, is that the government's definition of extremism wouldn't turn into a law by which people would be criminalised. It wouldn't mean that you would have committed an offence simply by being classed as extremists. So some of the concerns about the definition, I think, may be overplayed at this point.
That's interesting. I mean, where do you think the line is between freedom of expression and extremism?
Well, certainly if you're calling for violence, if you're encouraging and inciting terrorism, then I think it's very clear that you've crossed a threshold. In fact, you've probably at that point already crossed over into a criminal threshold. I think that what the definitions that are being looked at basically consist of, including the current definition that we already have, is talking about people who are anti-democratic and opposed to liberal values. Essentially, the way that it seems that we think about extremism is if you accept the fundamental principles of democracy and of liberalism and the rule of law, then you're within the circle of what's considered mainstream politics, and if you don't, then you're an extremist. So, I mean, that would be one definition that could be used. How practical that definition would be for government, I think, is another question. But what's very clear is that people within government don't always seem to understand which groups and which individuals are extremists and shouldn't be consulted with or funded. And I think that goes for the charity sector. Much of the extremist preaching that we've seen from ideologues is happening from organisations that have charitable status. It means that they enjoy certain tax exemptions, they enjoy legitimacy. And so being able to define those as extreme and remove their charitable status, I think would be an important step forward in the battle against extremism.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make about undermining democracy. That's something that Michael Gove has spoken about today, isn't it? And what about the fear that groups such as gender-critical feminists or devout Christians, Jews or Muslims could get caught up in this definition? You've touched on this already, but it's a fascinating area.
Well, I think that those concerns are completely valid because, again, going back to the Prevent review, there was concerns that the definition of what was being considered particularly extreme right-wing had become so broad that mainstream political commentators in some of the Prevent documentation seem to be being covered by that. So I think that underlines the importance of having a definition that is much narrower. But I would go back to the point about the fact that it is very difficult to come up with one-line definition that's going to cover everybody. Clearly within, say, gender-critical feminism or at the more extreme ends of parts of some Muslim communities, you are going to have people who've crossed over into the extremist threshold, but that's not most people. And so if you define extremism according to each individual ideology, I think you're much more likely to come up with something that's narrow and that protects the free speech of, for instance, most gender-critical feminists who have, a fair and reasonable point of view that deserves to be heard within our political conversation. And I think the government is very aware of that. I don't think those are the sort of people that they're looking to go after with this definition. and I think they will be aware of that when defining it.
Yeah, of course, and we may get a definition in the next few days. It'll be interesting to see what they come up with. Tom Wilson, great to get your thoughts. Thanks very much.